From the very first moment of Emily's life, something felt different. The delivery room, usually filled with the loud cry of a newborn, was instead wrapped in a heavy silence. Catherine Hayes, lying exhausted on the hospital bed, waited desperately for the sound every mother longs to hear. But no cry came. The doctors exchanged glances. Nurses rubbed the newborn's tiny chest, trying to provoke even the faintest wail. Nothing. Catherine's heart dropped. "Why isn't she crying?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her husband, Richard Hayes, the billionaire known for his cold composure in the business world, stood frozen, helpless for the first time in his life. He had faced boardroom wars, lawsuits, and billion-dollar deals, but never something like this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a faint gasp came from Emily, enough to confirm she was breathing. Relief washed over everyone in the room. But still, no cry, no sound beyond shallow breaths. The doctors reassured Catherine and Richard that Emily was alive and stable. Yet, the silence was louder than any scream could have been. In the days that followed, hope clung to the family like a fragile thread. "Maybe she's just a quiet baby," Catherine told herself. She held Emily close, singing lullabies, waiting for a coo, a giggle, even a babble. But Emily's lips remained sealed. She looked at her mother with wide, expressive eyes, but no sound escaped her mouth. The Hayes family tried not to worry at first. Catherine read books on parenting, consulted experts, and convinced herself Emily would find her voice in her own time. Richard, ever the man of solutions, arranged appointments with top specialists across the country. The best pediatricians, neurologists, and speech therapists examined the child. They scanned her throat, tested her hearing, and measured her development. The conclusion was devastating. Emily was mute. Not deaf, not unintelligent, simply mute. She could hear, she could understand, but she would never speak. Catherine wept that night, clutching Emily against her chest as if her love alone could change fate. "I just wanted to hear you say mama," she whispered. Richard, on the other hand, responded differently. He did not cry. He did not break. Instead, he buried himself in work. Business became his escape, and the mansion became his wife's burden. The Hayes mansion, a sprawling estate of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and golden staircases, was filled with everything money could buy, except the sound of a child's voice. Catherine filled Emily's nursery with toys, dolls, and books, hoping one of them would spark something. She painted the walls a soft lavender, hung mobiles above the crib, and played gentle music to keep her daughter comforted. But silence lingered like a shadow. Emily grew, and while other children laughed, shouted, and argued, Emily communicated through gestures and drawings. At family gatherings, cousins played games, but Emily stayed on the sidelines, drawing pictures of birds, flowers, and stars. She was bright and observant, but when asked a question, she only pointed or scribbled. Guests would often whisper, "Poor child," or "Such a shame," with all their wealth. Each word pierced Catherine's heart. She would smile politely, but behind closed doors, she broke down. The sound she longed for most wasn't music, wasn't laughter, wasn't chatter. It was simply her daughter's voice calling her mama. Richard handled it differently. A man used to controlling outcomes, he hated feeling powerless. When doctors gave their final verdict, he rejected it. "There has to be a solution. There's always a solution," he argued. He funded research programs, donated to speech clinics, and even flew in foreign specialists. But each time, the results were the same. Emily wasn't speaking, and perhaps she never would. Instead of facing his pain, Richard buried it under luxury. He bought Emily the finest clothes, diamond-studded hairpins, and toys from every corner of the world. He built her a private playroom larger than most people's homes. But Emily didn't care for expensive things. She only wanted time, presence, and love. Sadly, her father was too busy chasing an impossible cure and hiding his pain behind work. As Emily grew older, she became more aware of her silence. At first, she accepted it as normal. But when she watched children her age laughing at the park, singing in school performances, or calling out for their parents, she realized she was different. She would try to mimic them in the mirror, opening her mouth, forming shapes, but no sound came. Sometimes she would grow frustrated, banging her fists against the table, tears streaming down her face. Catherine tried to comfort her. "It's okay, my love. You don't need words for me to understand you." But Emily wasn't convinced. She wanted her voice. She wanted to be heard. One evening, Catherine found Emily asleep on her bed, clutching a crayon drawing. It showed a little girl with a speech bubble above her head, filled with empty lines. Catherine's tears fell onto the paper. That image haunted her. It was her daughter's unspoken cry for help. Life inside the Hayes mansion grew lonelier for Emily. Surrounded by wealth yet trapped in silence, she was like a song that could never be sung. Tutors came and went, each one trying new methods of communication, but none lasted long. Some grew impatient, others pitied her, and a few simply treated her like a fragile porcelain doll. But Emily wasn't fragile. She was strong, resilient, and full of emotions that only her eyes could express. Those who looked closely saw it, the depth in her gaze, the way she observed the world, the silent intelligence hiding behind her lips. Yet, for most, Emily was defined by what she lacked, not what she had. To society, she was the mute daughter of a billionaire. To her parents, she was a treasure, yes, but also a source of deep sorrow. The silence became unbearable. Catherine prayed every night, whispering to God, begging for a miracle. She promised that if Emily ever spoke, she would dedicate her life to gratitude. Richard, though less spiritual, made his own vow. He would stop at nothing to find a cure. But as years passed, they both grew weary. Their marriage strained under the weight of unspoken grief. Conversations between them became transactional, about doctors, treatments, schedules, but never about hope. Catherine often felt alone in her motherhood, carrying the emotional burden while Richard hid behind work. And yet, through it all, Emily continued to grow. She learned to express herself with art, painting vivid pictures that spoke louder than words. Her silence became her identity, but deep down, she longed for someone who could see beyond it. Someone who wouldn't treat her as broken or pitiful, but as a child full of life waiting to be understood. That someone would come soon. And when they did, Emily's silent world would change forever. The Hayes mansion was like a kingdom, grand, elegant, and filled with everything money could buy. But despite its beauty, it felt strangely empty. The staff moved silently through its wide halls, doing their jobs, but never daring to get too close to the family. Everyone knew the story of little Emily Hayes, the mute daughter of the billionaire, and while they pitied her, no one tried to understand her. Catherine, exhausted from years of emotional struggle, decided one summer morning that she needed more help around the house. Someone not just skilled, but dependable, steady, and kind. She wanted someone who could bring warmth into the cold walls of the mansion. That was when Grace arrived. Grace was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She wasn't like the other maids who came dressed stiffly, carrying themselves with formality. She walked with quiet confidence, her back straight but her spirit humble. Her dark skin glowed in the sunlight streaming through the doorway as she introduced herself. "Good morning, ma'am," she said softly to Catherine, bowing her head. "My name is Grace." From the very first handshake, Catherine felt something different. Grace's hands were rough from years of work, but her grip was steady, reassuring. She wasn't here just to clean floors or polish furniture. Something about her felt maternal, nurturing. Catherine didn't know why, but she felt comforted. "Welcome, Grace," she said, offering a rare smile. "You'll find this house has everything you'll need, but it's not always as happy as it looks." Grace didn't ask questions. She only nodded, as if she already understood. That afternoon, Grace was introduced to Emily. The little girl sat quietly in the garden, sketching in her notebook with colored pencils. She didn't notice Grace at first, too absorbed in her drawing of a small bird perched on a tree branch. Grace approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Good morning, Miss Emily," Grace said gently. Her voice was calm, soothing, like a lullaby. Emily lifted her eyes, her pencil still in her hand. She didn't respond, she never did, but she studied Grace with quiet curiosity. Instead of pulling away like most staff members did when Emily didn't answer, Grace crouched down beside her, lowering herself to the child's level. She looked at the drawing and gasped softly. "Oh my, that bird looks alive. You have magic in your hands." Emily blinked, unsure how to react. No one had ever spoken about her drawings with such admiration. Usually, adults just glanced and said, "That's nice," before walking away. But Grace stayed. "You know what this bird looks like?" Grace continued, pointing at the wings. "It looks like it wants to fly away, but it's waiting for someone to notice how beautiful it already is." For the first time, Emily's lips curved into a shy smile. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Grace noticed it and smiled back, as if they had just shared a secret. From that day on, Grace treated Emily differently than anyone else ever had. She didn't look at her as the mute daughter. She didn't act as if Emily was broken. She simply treated her as a little girl. When Emily wanted to help in the kitchen, Grace let her stir the batter, even if flour spilled everywhere. When Emily wanted to arrange flowers in a vase, Grace praised her choices, even if the stems were crooked. Most importantly, Grace gave Emily her time. While other staff members were busy with their duties, rushing around the mansion, Grace made space to sit with her. Sometimes they played simple games, clapping rhythms, arranging blocks by color, or drawing side by side. Other times they just sat in silence, watching birds outside the window. But Grace's silence was different from Emily's. It wasn't heavy or sad, it was peaceful. It was the kind of silence that said, "I understand you," even without words. Catherine noticed the change almost immediately. Emily, who used to sit alone for hours, now followed Grace around like a shadow. If Grace went to dust the library, Emily trailed behind, carrying a small cloth to help. If Grace went to water the garden, Emily held the little watering can with both hands, her face glowing with pride. One evening, Catherine walked past the nursery and saw something that stopped her in her tracks. Grace sat on the floor, humming softly while braiding Emily's hair. Emily, in turn, rested her head against Grace's lap, her eyes half closed with comfort. Catherine's throat tightened. For years, she had tried to fill Emily's silence with toys and therapy, but Grace was filling it with something much simpler: love. Richard, however, was harder to convince. He saw Grace as just another maid. "Don't get too attached," he warned Catherine one night. "Staff come and go. Emily needs professionals, not housekeepers." But Catherine shook her head. "You don't see it, Richard. Emily trusts her. Do you know how rare that is? Grace has done more in a week than doctors have in years." Richard dismissed the conversation, as he often did. But deep down, even he couldn't deny the small changes. Emily laughed, silently. Yes, but her eyes sparkled in ways they hadn't before. She hugged Grace freely, something she never did with strangers. And when she was upset, she reached for Grace's hand for comfort. Grace, on the other hand, never saw herself as doing anything extraordinary. She believed children needed patience, attention, and unconditional care. She noticed how Emily's eyes lit up when she felt seen. She noticed how Emily communicated through her art, her gestures, and even her silence. One afternoon, as Grace folded laundry, Emily tugged at her sleeve and handed her a drawing. It showed two stick figures holding hands, one taller, one smaller. Grace's heart swelled. She recognized herself and Emily in the picture. "Oh, sweetheart," Grace whispered, hugging her. "You drew us." Emily smiled again, her silence no longer empty, but full of meaning. The mansion staff began whispering among themselves. "Have you noticed the girl with Grace? She actually smiles now. It's like Grace brought light into her life." And they were right. Grace had become more than a maid. She was becoming the bridge between Emily's silent world and the rest of the family. But Grace also sensed something deeper. Behind Emily's bright eyes, there was still a shadow, a flicker of fear, a heaviness she couldn't quite name. Grace didn't press, but she paid attention. She noticed how Emily sometimes froze when an adult raised their voice, even if it wasn't directed at her. She noticed how Emily hummed quietly to herself when she thought no one was listening, only to stop abruptly the moment she realized she was being watched. Grace's instincts told her there was more to Emily's silence than anyone had realized. But she kept that thought tucked away, knowing the time would come when the truth would reveal itself. For now, she focused on building trust, one small step at a time. She believed in something no doctor or billionaire could buy, that love and patience could heal wounds invisible to the eye. And slowly, but surely, Emily began to bloom in Grace's presence. The mansion, once silent and cold, now carried the quiet hum of something new. Not words, not voices, but connection. Grace had stepped into Emily's world without trying to change her, and in doing so, she had already changed everything. What no one knew yet was that Grace's arrival wasn't just timely, it was destiny. Because soon, she would uncover the truth that everyone else had overlooked. And when that truth came to light, Emily's silence would never be the same again. The Hayes mansion, though filled with wealth, had always been a quiet place. Too quiet. But since Grace arrived, there was a subtle shift. The silence wasn't as heavy anymore. Emily had begun to smile more, to draw with brighter colors, and to follow Grace around like a shadow. Still, Emily hadn't spoken. Not once at least. Not until that night when Grace stumbled upon something she never expected. It was late evening, the kind where the house seemed to sigh with exhaustion after a long day. Most of the staff had already retired to their quarters, and Catherine was upstairs reading while Richard was away on business as usual. Grace stayed behind in the library, dusting the tall shelves stacked with books no one ever seemed to read. She hummed softly as she worked, her favorite hymn from childhood. The kind of tune that made her feel peaceful, like a prayer whispered in secret. Then, she froze. From the other side of the room, faintly but unmistakably, she heard something. A sound. A soft, trembling hum. Grace turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. At first, she thought it might be the wind whistling through a crack in the old windows. But no, the sound was too delicate, too intentional. It had a rhythm, a melody. Her heart skipped. She followed the sound carefully, her footsteps light against the polished wood floor. At the far end of the library, near the tall glass windows that looked out into the moonlit garden, stood Emily. The little girl was clutching her sketchbook to her chest, staring out at the night sky. And her lips, those lips that had never spoken a word, were moving. A faint hum escaped her mouth, fragile but real. Grace stopped in her tracks. She didn't want to frighten her. She didn't want the sound to vanish like a fragile dream. Instead of speaking, Grace gently clapped her hands to the rhythm of Emily's hum, joining her silently, showing her she was not alone. Emily froze instantly. The sound stopped. She spun around, her wide eyes filled with panic. Her little hands clutched her sketchbook tighter, as though caught in a secret she wasn't meant to share. Grace's heart broke at the sight. Emily wasn't just mute. She was afraid. Terrified. Grace knelt down, lowering herself to Emily's level. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice like velvet. "I heard you, and I'm so proud of you." Emily shook her head violently, her lips trembling. Tears filled her eyes. She backed away as if she had done something wrong. Grace raised her hands slowly, palms open, showing she meant no harm. "You don't have to hide from me. I won't tell anyone if you don't want me to. I promise." Emily's chest rose and fell rapidly, the way a child breathes when fear has its grip. Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to Grace, silently pleading her not to say anything. In that moment, 1,000 questions rushed through Grace's mind. If Emily could hum, if she could make sound, then maybe she wasn't truly mute. But if that were true, why had she stayed silent for so many years? Why had doctors, therapists, and specialists failed to notice? Why did Emily look scared to let her voice be heard? The realization struck Grace like lightning. Emily's silence wasn't from inability. It was from fear. But fear of what? That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her small quarters, staring at the ceiling, her mind restless. She replayed the moment over and over. The fragile hum, the panic in Emily's eyes, the way she clutched her sketchbook like a shield. Grace thought back on all the little things she had noticed since arriving. The way Emily froze when someone raised their voice, even if it wasn't at her. The way she sometimes mouthed words silently in the mirror, but quickly looked over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. The way her hands trembled slightly whenever a stranger tried to engage with her. These were not the signs of a child who couldn't speak. These were the signs of a child who had been made to believe she shouldn't. Grace's chest tightened with emotion. She had seen this before. In her years of working with children from broken or difficult homes, she had met kids who stopped speaking after being ridiculed, punished, or shamed. Words weren't just taken from them. They were buried deep inside, locked away by fear. Could that be Emily's truth? The next morning, Grace watched Emily carefully. She didn't bring up what she had witnessed, knowing the child was fragile. Instead, she tried to gently encourage small sounds. She hummed while sweeping, sang softly while cooking, even tapped rhythms on the table while Emily drew. Each time, she hoped Emily might hum again, or even whisper, but Emily stayed silent, her guard back up. Grace didn't push. She knew healing wasn't about force, it was about patience. Still, her heart ached. She wanted to scoop Emily into her arms and say, "You're safe now. You don't have to be afraid anymore." But she didn't yet know the source of that fear. Until she did, Emily's silence would remain a mystery. One rainy afternoon, the truth began to slip through the cracks. Emily sat by the window, watching droplets race down the glass, her sketchbook on her lap. Grace sat nearby, folding laundry, humming her familiar tune. Suddenly, Emily's pencil scratched quickly against the page. She held it up to Grace when she finished. It was a picture of a little girl standing in the corner of a room, her mouth open in a speech bubble, but the bubble was filled with scribbled black lines. Above her stood a taller figure, towering and angry, drawn with sharp strokes and heavy hands. Grace's breath caught. "Emily, who is this?" she asked gently. Emily didn't answer. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. She pressed the notebook to her chest as if to hide it. Grace's heart ached. She didn't push, but in that drawing, she saw the truth. Emily wasn't mute by birth. She had been silenced by someone, somehow. That night, Grace sat in her room and cried quietly. For the first time, she understood the depth of Emily's pain. This wasn't just a medical condition. This was trauma. She whispered into the night, "Dear Lord, give me strength to help her. Let me be her voice until she finds her own." Grace made a decision then and there. She wouldn't stop until she uncovered the full truth, because in Emily's eyes, she had seen something powerful. Beneath the fear, beneath the silence, there was a spark, a voice that had been hidden, locked away, but not destroyed. And Grace knew, if she could help Emily feel safe enough, that voice would come back. The mansion remained unaware of Grace's discovery. Catherine still believed her daughter was mute. Richard still buried himself in business, convinced no miracle was possible, but Grace carried the secret in her heart like a fragile flame. She knew Emily's silence wasn't permanent. It was a wound waiting to be healed. She also knew something else. Healing wouldn't come from doctors, money, or force. It would come from love, patience, and truth. And Grace was ready to give all three. The days following Grace's discovery felt heavier than before. She carried the secret in her heart, that Emily was not truly mute, that somewhere within her was a voice waiting to be freed. But Grace knew this kind of wound couldn't be healed overnight. It wasn't about coaxing sound from a throat. It was about untangling fear from a fragile soul. Grace began a mission, quiet but determined. She would not force Emily. She would not pressure her. Instead, she would give her something she had been denied for far too long: safety. Every morning, Grace greeted Emily with a smile, never asking her to speak, but always giving her opportunities to choose connection. She sang softly while folding laundry, sometimes silly songs, sometimes lullabies from her childhood. She clapped rhythms on the table while Emily colored. She read bedtime stories aloud, pausing dramatically in places as if inviting Emily to fill in the missing words. Even if Emily never did, it was a slow dance between them, full of patience and tiny gestures. Grace could see the longing in Emily's eyes, longing to respond, to be heard, but fear still wrapped around her like chains. Catherine noticed the closeness growing and marveled. "She trusts you more than anyone," she said one evening as Grace tucked Emily into bed. "Even me, sometimes." Grace smiled softly. "Children know who sees them, ma'am. Truly sees them." Catherine's eyes glistened, but she said nothing more. The breakthrough came on a stormy afternoon. Thunder rolled outside the mansion, shaking the windows. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, turning the garden into a blur of gray. Emily sat in her room, curled in the corner with her sketchbook, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Grace rushed in, alarmed. "Emily, sweetheart, what's wrong?" The little girl shook her head violently, clutching the sketchbook to her chest. Her hands trembled. She scribbled furiously on the page, then shoved it toward Grace. The drawing was heartbreaking. It showed a little girl standing alone under a dark cloud, with rain pouring down on her. Beside her was a speech bubble filled with jagged black scribbles. Above her, written in shaky letters, was a single word: scared. Grace's breath caught. She knelt down, her hands shaking as she reached for Emily's. Scared? She whispered. Emily nodded, her tears falling faster now. Grace pulled the child into her arms. It's okay, my darling. You're safe here. You can tell me anything. And then, it happened that Emily's lips quivered. She took a shaky breath, and in the softest, trembling voice, a single word slipped out: scared. For a moment, the room froze. The thunder outside seemed to pause. The rain seemed to hush, as if the whole world leaned in to listen. Grace's eyes widened, filling with tears. She had heard it. Not a hum, not an accident, but an actual word. Emily had spoken. "Oh, my angel," Grace whispered, hugging her tightly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You did it. You spoke. I'm so proud of you." Emily buried her face in Grace's shoulder, shaking with sobs. But Grace didn't care. She held her as if she were holding the most precious treasure on earth. "You're not broken, Emily," Grace whispered into her hair. "You have a voice, and it's beautiful. Don't ever be afraid to use it." That night, Grace stayed by Emily's side until she fell asleep, her small body finally resting after the storm of emotions. Grace sat in the chair beside her bed, staring at the child's peaceful face, her own heart pounding. This wasn't just progress. This was proof. Emily could speak, but now Grace faced a new challenge. She had to uncover why Emily had silenced herself for so long. Something had buried her voice, something that had made her believe it was safer not to speak. Grace vowed she would find out. The next few days, she continued her gentle encouragement. She didn't demand Emily speak again. Instead, she created moments where Emily might feel safe enough to try. She asked yes or no questions and gave her crayons to draw her answers. She praised every attempt, no matter how small. Sometimes Emily whispered a sound, just one, then covered her mouth quickly, eyes wide with fear. Each time, Grace reassured her, "You're safe. Nobody will ever hurt you for speaking. Not while I'm here." Slowly, a bond formed that went deeper than anything Grace had ever experienced. She wasn't just Emily's maid. She was her protector, her anchor, her safe place. One evening, while the sun set and painted the sky orange and pink, Grace decided to try something different. She sat with Emily in the garden, the smell of wet earth still lingering from the storm the day before. She pointed to the flowers and began naming them aloud. "Rose," she said, touching the red bloom. "Daisy," she added, pointing at the white petals. "Sunflower," she continued with a smile. Then she looked at Emily and asked softly, "Do you want to try?" Emily hesitated. Her little hands twisted together nervously. Her lips parted, then closed again. Finally, she leaned closer and whispered the faintest sound, "Ro." Her voice cracked, but Grace's heart soared. She clapped her hands gently in excitement. "Yes, Rose, you did it, sweetheart." Emily's eyes lit up with both fear and pride. For the first time, she felt the warmth of being celebrated for her voice. Not shamed, not silenced, but cherished. Yet Grace knew this was only the beginning. For every word Emily whispered, there was still a shadow of fear lurking behind her. Something had convinced this child that speaking was dangerous. Something had locked her voice away for years. Grace was determined to uncover it, but she didn't push. She knew Emily would reveal the truth when she was ready. For now, she focused on building trust, showing her every day that her words had value. Meanwhile, Catherine began noticing changes too. Emily no longer looked as sad. She carried her sketchbook with more confidence. And sometimes Catherine even caught her mouthing words silently, practicing to herself. One night, Catherine approached Grace, her voice trembling. Has she spoken to you?" Grace hesitated. She wanted to protect Emily's privacy, but she also knew Catherine deserved to know. "Yes, ma'am. Just a little. But it's a start. She has a voice." Catherine burst into tears, covering her mouth. "Oh, my baby. I thought I'd never hear her." Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. "You will. In time. She just needs patience and love and safety." Catherine nodded through her tears, finally allowing a flicker of hope to return. That night, as Grace tucked Emily into bed, she whispered a promise. "One day, Emily, you'll speak freely." And when that day comes, the whole world will hear the beauty you've been hiding. I'll be with you every step of the way." Emily looked at her with those wide, trusting eyes, and for the first time, she whispered back, "Promise." Grace's heart swelled. She kissed her forehead gently. "Promise." And so, the silence began to crack, little by little. Emily's voice, though fragile, had broken through, but the question remained. What had silenced her in the first place? Grace didn't know yet, but she was determined to find out. Because deep down, she knew the real battle was not just helping Emily speak, that it was uncovering the truth that had stolen her voice in the first place. Grace had always believed that silence was never empty. It carried meaning, secrets, and truths too painful to put into words. With Emily, the silence had been thick and suffocating. But now that Grace had heard fragments of the child's voice, she knew for certain. There was a story buried deep within her. The question was, what had silenced Emily for so long? The answer began to unravel one evening when Grace sat with Emily in the nursery. The house was quiet. Catherine was in her study, reading letters, and Richard was away on another business trip. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug, coloring as usual, while Grace mended a torn dress nearby. Without warning, Emily dropped her crayon and froze, her eyes fixed on the door. Grace looked up. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Emily didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her sketchbook, her hands trembling, and began scribbling furiously. She pushed the drawing toward Grace when she was done. Grace's stomach tightened as she saw it. The drawing showed a tall figure, sketched in dark, heavy lines, towering over a small child. The tall figure's mouth was wide open, jagged like a monster's. The small child stood in the corner with tears streaming down her face, a speech bubble filled with scribbled black scratches above her head. Grace swallowed hard. "Is this you, Emily?" she asked softly. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. "And this person, who is it?" Grace's voice was gentle but urgent. Emily hesitated. Her lips parted, and for the first time, she whispered a word that chilled Grace to her core. "Nanny." Grace's breath caught. A nanny? That meant this wasn't just fear of strangers. It was tied to someone who had once cared for her. Someone trusted. She took Emily's tiny hands in her own. "Sweetheart, what did the nanny do?" Emily's lips trembled. She shook her head violently, her whole body shaking. Grace quickly pulled her close, rocking her gently. "It's okay, baby. You don't have to tell me all at once. You're safe. Nobody can hurt you anymore." But Emily whispered again, her voice broken, as though the memory itself hurt. She shouted. Grace's chest ached. She stroked the child's hair gently, encouraging her without pressure. "What did she say, Emily?" Emily squeezed her eyes shut, her voice trembling as she forced the words out. She said, "No one wants to hear me. That I'm annoying. That my voice is ugly." Grace felt as if someone had driven a knife into her heart. Her arms tightened protectively around the little girl. That was it. The cruel words of a caregiver had planted a seed of fear so deep that Emily had locked away her voice for years. It wasn't a medical condition. It wasn't biology. It was trauma. Grace blinked back tears as anger rose inside her. How could anyone say such things to a child? Especially a child as gentle and bright as Emily? To silence her in such a cruel way, it was unforgivable. But she knew anger wouldn't help Emily. What Emily needed was healing. "Listen to me, sweetheart," Grace said firmly, holding her shoulders so Emily would look at her. "That nanny was wrong. She lied to you. Your voice is not ugly. Your voice is beautiful, and I want to hear it as much as you'll let me." Emily stared at her, wide-eyed, as if trying to believe the words. For so long, she had believed the lie. Could she really trust this new truth? Over the next few days, Emily revealed more in fragments. Grace learned that when Emily was 3 years old, her nanny had been strict and cruel. If Emily laughed too loudly or tried to speak during meals, the nanny scolded her harshly. Once, during a dinner with guests, Emily had excitedly tried to tell her mother something. The nanny snapped in front of everyone. "Quiet. No one wants to hear your squeaky little voice. You're nothing but a nuisance." The words had cut into her like a blade. That night, Emily stopped trying to speak. And every time she even thought about making a sound afterward, she remembered the nanny's glare, the disgust in her voice, and the shame that followed. The silence had become her shield. Grace wept when she heard the full story. She sat awake one night, her Bible on her lap, praying for strength. Lord, this child has carried pain no child should ever carry. Give me the wisdom to help her believe in herself again. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she could rewrite the future. The next morning, she began creating moments for Emily to reclaim her voice, not just with whispers, but with courage. One afternoon, Grace and Emily baked cookies together in the kitchen. Flour dusted their faces, and chocolate chips scattered across the counter. As they worked, Grace hummed a silly tune and encouraged Emily to join in at a tea first. Emily shook her head. But when Grace exaggerated the notes, pretending to sing terribly on purpose, Emily giggled silently. Grace leaned in and whispered, "Come on, laugh out loud. Let me hear that beautiful sound." Emily hesitated. Then a tiny laugh escaped her lips. It was faint, shaky, but it was there. Grace clapped her flour-covered hands together. "That's it. That's your laugh. Oh, it's the sweetest sound I've ever heard." Emily blushed, half hiding her face, but the sparkle in her eyes showed pride she hadn't felt in years. Another day, Grace found Emily in the garden, staring at a butterfly. She knelt beside her and whispered, "Butterfly." Then she looked at Emily expectantly. Emily bit her lip, her little fists clenched at her sides. Grace didn't rush her. She waited. Finally, Emily whispered back, "Butterfly." Tears filled Grace's eyes instantly. She hugged her tight. "Yes. See, you can do it. You're finding your voice again." Emily leaned into her embrace, her tiny body trembling. But this time it wasn't from fear. It was from release. Grace knew it was time to tell Catherine and Richard the truth. They had lived for years believing their daughter was mute by nature, when in reality, her silence was the scar of cruel words. But Grace worried. Would they believe her? Would they accept that all the doctors had been wrong? She decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that Emily's parents knew their daughter was not broken, just wounded and healing. That evening, Grace gathered her courage. Catherine was in the living room, sipping tea. Richard had just returned from a trip, his suit jacket still on, his briefcase at his side. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," Grace began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I need to tell you something about Emily." Both looked up, startled. Grace continued, "Your daughter isn't mute. She can speak. I've heard her." Richard frowned immediately. "That's impossible. Doctors." But Grace cut him off gently. "Doctors saw what they thought was true. But I've seen the deeper truth. Emily's silence isn't a disability. It's fear. Fear planted by someone who told her that her voice didn't matter." Catherine's teacup slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. Her face drained of color. What do you mean?" Grace took a deep breath. "Her old nanny. Emily told me. She was cruel to her. She shouted at her, told her no one wanted to hear her. Your daughter believed those words, and she locked her voice away." Catherine gasped, tears spilling instantly. "No, my baby." Richard shook his head in disbelief, his walls beginning to crack. "Are you saying all these years it was never medical?" Grace nodded firmly. All these years, Emily's voice was waiting. She just needed someone to make her feel safe enough to use it again. The room fell silent, but it was no longer the heavy silence of before. It was the silence before a storm of change. For the first time, Catherine and Richard saw hope, not the kind bought with money or doctors, but the hope born from love and truth. And Emily, standing quietly in the doorway, had heard every word. Her eyes shone with tears, but this time, she wasn't just scared. She was ready. The truth had shattered the mansion's fragile silence like a hammer striking glass. Grace's words still echoed through the room. Emily isn't mute. She's afraid. For a long moment, no one spoke. Catherine stood frozen, her trembling hands clutching her chest, while Richard paced back and forth like a man who had lost all control. Emily, small and quiet, lingered at the doorway, her wide eyes darting between the adults. It was Grace who finally broke the tension. She walked toward Emily and knelt at her side. "Sweetheart, come here." Emily hesitated, her tiny fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. But then, with cautious steps, she crossed the room and slipped her hand into Grace's. Grace looked up at Catherine and Richard. "She doesn't need pity. She doesn't need more doctors. She needs you, both of you. She needs to know that her voice is wanted, that her parents long to hear her." Catherine covered her mouth, tears streaming freely now. Richard's jaw clenched, the weight of guilt pressing down on him like never before. He had built empires, amassed fortunes, but here, in front of his daughter, he felt utterly powerless. Grace turned to Emily, stroking her hair. "Do you want to try, darling? Just a word. Something for Mama and Papa." Emily's lips quivered. She shook her head at first, fear clouding her face. The memory of cruel words still lingered, whispering that she wasn't enough. Catherine fell to her knees, reaching out. "Emily, my baby, you don't ever have to be afraid. If you never speak again, I will still love you more than anything. But if you wanna, oh, how I would treasure hearing your voice." Richard, his pride stripped away, knelt beside his wife. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Please, Emily, forgive us. We should have protected you. Your voice means more to us than all the wealth in this world." For the first time, Emily saw her parents not as distant figures weighed down by status and expectations, but as two broken souls desperately reaching for her. Her small hands trembled as she looked at Grace. "Safe?" she whispered, barely audible. Grace's heart leapt. Emily had spoken again. She squeezed her hand firmly. "Yes, sweetheart. You're safe. I promise." The room went utterly still. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her lips. Richard's eyes widened, disbelief and hope colliding in his face. Emily swallowed hard, her tiny voice trembling as she looked at her mother. "Mama," Catherine broke. She collapsed into sobs, gathering her daughter into her arms. "Oh, my angel. My sweet, sweet girl. I've waited so long to hear you. Your voice is perfect, perfect." Richard, tears burning in his eyes, wrapped his arms around them both. "Emily, you've given me the greatest gift of my life. I swear, I'll never let anyone silence you again." Emily wept softly, clinging to both parents, her fragile heart finally beginning to believe the truth. Her voice was not a curse. It was a gift. The days that followed were unlike any the Hayes family had known before. For the first time, the mansion was alive with sound. Not the hollow echo of footsteps or the stiff chatter of wealthy guests, but the fragile, blossoming words of a child learning to reclaim her place in the world. At first, Emily spoke only in whispers, one word at a time. Grace would cheer every effort, Catherine would shower her with hugs, and Richard, who once measured success in profits, now measured it in syllables from his daughter's lips. "Good morning. I love you. Thank you." Each phrase was a miracle, each word a victory. Grace continued to work patiently, guiding Emily like a gardener tending to a delicate flower. She played word games, sang nursery rhymes, and gently encouraged Emily to read short lines from storybooks. Bit by bit, Emily's confidence grew, but it wasn't just about words. It was about freedom. Emily began to laugh again, not silently, but with sound that rang like bells through the halls. She began to sing softly with Grace in the kitchen, her little voice quivering at first, but growing steadier each day. One evening, Richard walked into the living room to find Emily sitting at the piano, pressing the keys with curious fingers. She looked up at him shyly. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "Papa, play?" Richard froze. For years, he had dreamed of hearing his daughter call him that. His throat tightened as he sat beside her and, with trembling hands, began to play a soft tune. Emily hummed along, her little voice weaving into the melody like sunlight breaking through clouds. In that moment, Richard realized something he had never understood before. His wealth, his status, his empire, none of it mattered compared to the sound of his daughter's voice. Catherine, too, found herself transformed. She stopped worrying about appearances, about the whispers of high society. Instead, she poured her energy into being present for Emily, reading her stories, braiding her hair, listening intently to every precious word. She told her over and over again, "Your voice is my favorite sound in the world." And slowly, Emily began to believe it. Yet through it all, Grace remained the steady anchor. Catherine and Richard often told her, "We don't know how to thank you." But Grace would simply smile and say, "Don't thank me. Thank Emily." She was brave enough to try. Still, deep inside, Grace knew the truth. If she hadn't listened, if she hadn't cared enough to look past silence, Emily's voice might have stayed hidden forever. Months passed, and Emily bloomed like spring after a long winter. One Sunday, Catherine and Richard decided to host a small family gathering. It was nothing like their usual grand parties. No polished performances, no glittering ballrooms. Just an intimate evening with close relatives. As everyone gathered, Catherine gently encouraged Emily. "Would you like to say something to everyone?" The room fell quiet. All eyes turned to the little girl, who once would have hidden behind her sketchbook. Emily glanced at Grace, who gave her a reassuring nod. Then, taking a deep breath, Emily stepped forward. Her tiny voice, though still soft, carried across the room. "Hello, my name is Emily. I'm happy you're here." Gasps filled the room, followed by applause and tears. Catherine sobbed openly. Richard's hands shook as he clapped, and Grace felt her heart swell with pride. Emily smiled shyly, but for the first time, she didn't look down in fear. She stood tall, her voice reclaiming the space that had once been stolen from her. Later that night, when the guests had left and the house grew quiet again, Emily climbed into Grace's lap. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Grace hugged her tightly, her eyes wet with tears. "And I always will, sweetheart. You'll never be silenced again." Emily rested her head on Grace's shoulder, her tiny voice warm and steady. "I love you." Grace closed her eyes, holding her close. "I love you too, Angel. More than words can say." From that night onward, the Hayes mansion was never the same. The silence that had once haunted its halls was gone. In its place were laughter, songs, bedtime stories spoken aloud, and the joyful chatter of a little girl rediscovering her world. And though Grace was just a maid in title, to Emily, she was far more. She was the one who had uncovered the truth, broken the chains of silence, and given her back the greatest gift of all, her voice. In life, it is often not the loudest voices that hold the most power, but the quiet ones that wait patiently to be heard. Emily's silence was not weakness, it was survival, and her voice, once freed, became a testimony of courage, love, and the healing power of being truly seen.